Good day, everyone. It's Alan Shimel for DevOps.com, and welcome to another great DevOps.com webinar. And we do have a great webinar in store for you today. It is sponsored by our friends at JumpCloud. And for those of you who don't know, JumpCloud is a company kind of with a special relationship to us here at DevOps.com, in that it's my friend Rajat Bhargava, who's the CEO founder of the company. And Raj and I have worked, I don't know, Raj, should we tell them how old you are?
I think it's a long time. Let's just say that. Very, very long time.
It was before that we were in the 2000s, I'll say that. Anyway, but regardless, JumpCloud is a company, though, that faces forward, not backwards, right? And what we're going to be talking about today is, I think, a really great kind of concept that JumpCloud's come up with here. But it really goes to the heart of what they've been doing for the last couple of years. It's called the Domainless Enterprise. It's a simplified and secure IT infrastructure for the future. Before we jump into it, though, I want to just take, Raj, if you don't mind, I'm going to take a minute or two and just do a little bit of housekeeping. For those of you who have been to our DevOps.com webinars before, you know we use the GoToWebinar webinar system. And for most of you, that means you have a GoToWebinar control panel up in your top right corner. If you look at that control panel, you'll see there are various sections within it. A couple I want to call to your attention. Number one, you'll see a section marked questions. And if you hit the little caret or arrow next to the word question, so it's downward facing, you will expand that section. And you can see that you can type your questions in there. What the really great thing about doing that is you don't have to remember your questions for the question section. We'll try to get to questions throughout today's webinar, but you don't have to remember when we say, okay, put in your question, go ahead. Type your question in, they're queued. There's a record of them. If for some reason we don't have time to get to your question, we can answer you offline via email or what have you, and you will get your question answered. So it's a great way, especially if you're like me, I tend to get multiple questions in a webinar. And if I remember the first one, I probably won't remember the third one, etc. So please use the question section for any questions that pop up as a result of what Raj and I are going to present to you. Secondly, I want to focus you down to the chat section. The chat section here at DevOps.com and how we use GoToWebinar is our technical support area. If you're having an issue, maybe the audio is messing up, or your videos, the slides are not progressing, anything wrong, but you can still get to that chat area, please let our engineers know we have people standing by. We will try to help you, try to get the most out of the webinar, regardless of your technical issues. On top of that, for those who are wondering, yes, this is being recorded. Yes, it will be available on DevOps.com, on our YouTube channel, on our digitalanarchist.com video platform, as well as perhaps from the JumpCloud channels as well. Looks like we might have lost Raj's video there for a moment. Hopefully he'll be able to pop back on. Anyway.
Be back now, Alan.
Okay.
Hear me, Alan.
There you go. Okay, we got you.
We had an internet hiccup here.
All right. Well, this is what happens when we work from home during COVID.
Exactly.
But that's more reason why we're going to talk about the Domainless Enterprise and why it's important to you. Anyway, let me get done with cleaning up. Questions, put them in the questions section. Technical issues, put them in the chat section. Let's get on with this great webinar. So as I mentioned, my co-host for the webinar today is a very good old friend of mine. Well, we're friends for a very long time. He's not old, but it's Rajat Bhargava. Raj is a serial entrepreneur. He's had 8 or 9 founded companies, bunch of tremendous success, but also one of the nicest, smartest people I've met in my life. And Raj and I have actually done a bunch of businesses together. JumpCloud is his latest. It's had a tremendous run as it's redefined and what has become now we're going to call the Domainless Enterprise. But really it's about, you know, one of the biggest monopolies in technology was Microsoft's AD technology, right? Active Directory. And as we've moved to the cloud, that, like so many other technologies and near monopolies, have been disrupted. So we're going to talk about what that means in terms of this Domainless Enterprise. First of all, Raj, welcome and thank you. Lost your video there, but you can talk if you can. Oh, offline. All right. I'm going to carry things on, Raj. I'm sure we'll be right back. Jade, why don't you go to our next slide? So I don't know if this is going to come as a surprise to anyone, but we have now seen multiple surveys. This particular one is from Gartner, but I've probably seen a half a dozen surveys with similar findings, which is we are entering a new normal era. This COVID thing, God willing, is not going to last forever. We are going to have a vaccine, hopefully, sooner than later. We are going to have therapeutics, but we're not going to go back to the way things are. In this particular Gartner survey, it was CFOs, but I've seen surveys of CEOs, CIOs. The idea of remote workers and people not being within the confines of the land, within the office, is something that's going to stay. 74% of CFOs will shift some employees to remote work permanently after the pandemic. Most of the ones that I've seen say that something like 2/3 of people will probably only come into their office on a part-time basis, 1 to 2, maybe 3 days a week at most, and spend 2 to 3 or more days a week working from home. This is a shift of unknown proportions. We've never seen anything like this. In the tech industry, we're somewhat lucky or jaded in that many of us have worked remotely at our leisure, right? When we wanted to, we didn't have to come into the office. But for the rest of the world outside the tech industry, that's not necessarily the norm. But it looks like it be the new norm. And I think that's going to have repercussions throughout the IT cycle. And as we wait for Raj to get back on here, hopefully he'll be joining us soon. But I think we can't lose sight of what just that one thing, the remote workers, what is that going to mean for the industry as a whole? Jade, if you can jump to the next slide for us, please. So one of the areas, especially when it comes to cybersecurity, that this remote work or this new normal of remote work is going to mean is the attack surface here is drastically changed. Okay, and with this attack surface changing, the very nature of the threats we face have changed, right? So now we're no longer in a perimeterized land where we have internal apps and maybe we go out via a VPN or something to external apps. No, in this new normal that we're living in, we have devices that don't run Windows anymore. Where Windows at one time, look, when Raj and I first started working together, Windows were 92% of the market. I don't think they're 75% of the market today, frankly. When we take into account not just computers, but tablets and phones and other mobile devices. So you have all these non-Windows OSs. And you know what? Those non-Windows devices, they don't run on Active Directory necessarily. And they don't run well on directory services, LDAP and so forth, that were built to run within the WAN. It's about the SD-WAN now. Oh, and I think we got Raj back here, hopefully. Raj, we've just been going on, no problem. Jump in when you feel you'd like to. In addition to these non-Windows devices that we're running on, and as I said, I don't think Windows is even 70–75% of our devices anymore. We also live in a SaaS world, SaaS apps with SaaS ops. So many of the applications that we're running today don't reside on our own infrastructure. We connect to these apps everywhere in the world, literally, through many different clouds. And so again, having an old-fashioned directory service that is somehow going to regulate our access to applications that don't live on our infrastructure, it doesn't work. It's a different world. It's the new normal out there. And then, of course, there's basic cloud infrastructure itself, right? We are moving away from that hub and spoke. We're moving away from the moat and the perimeter. We're moving, infrastructure is fungible, right? It can be anywhere and everywhere. It's in multiple places, multi-cloud, hybrid cloud. This isn't, again, like I said, when Raj and I first met in the 90s, 92% Windows devices, and we were running out of an app in one data center. As a matter of fact, one of the companies Raj and I first did together was called Interliant. It was an ASP, and we were offering Lotus Notes hosting from a data center. No internet, no VM, no nothing. It was impossible. It never worked, quite frankly. But you didn't have anything like you have now in terms of this infrastructure. Raj, can you hear me?
I can. Sorry, internet gods are not with me
No,
today.
I hear that's what we do in COVID times. We work around it. No big deal.
Yep.
So I've laid it out here, Raj. We don't rely predominantly on Windows like we did. We live in a SaaS ops world where these third-party apps that we rely on and make us go, we don't manage them. They're not our infrastructure either. We just connect to them. And then the cloud infrastructure itself that we use on, it's everywhere and anywhere, right? So the attack surface here is just infinitely bigger. And the idea of having a single domain with a directory that's going to, allow you to manage all this, what we had before just doesn't, it's not designed for this. I mean, it's the wrong tool, wrong time, wrong job. So
don't forget, Alan, people are mobile too now. So,
right.
When we started with this concept of the domain, it's been 20 years. That concept was we all went to an office. We physically showed up at that office. We plugged in, and that's where we were. And the concept of the domain was mimicking the physical proximity that we had to the office and the network. And from there, it started to change, right? We, like you said, we got non-Windows OSs, we got web applications, cloud infrastructure, but then we also had mobility. Not only mobility with phones and tablets, but mobility of people. And we started working from all kinds of different places. And so this concept of going to a physical office, and especially now in COVID times when, virtually the world is working from home, it's a completely different world. And the legacy approaches that we used in the past don't make sense for what we need for the future.
Well, not only don't they make sense, they don't work, right? And forgive, but the slide before where we talked about that Gartner survey, which really, reinforced maybe a half a dozen other surveys I saw, which is the new normal is, even God willing, we have a vaccine and this COVID thing is in our rearview mirror. No one is going back to the office the way it was before. We might, 74% of CFOs say, they're not going back to that. Most people may go back to an office part-time and work from home part-time. So there's a new normal that has been put in here, and the old ways, that old kind of domain, it's just not built for this.
So Alan, what would happen normally in these times is we would then VPN into our network at the home office. But now, over the last 10 years, we've taken a lot of that infrastructure out of the office. So you're VPNing into an empty shell of a network. Your cloud applications aren't there. Your infrastructure is at AWS or GCP or Azure. Your files are all across the web and the internet. So why are you VPNing into an empty office only to then go to all of your resource? It's because there's this domain concept and you are required to VPN in order to authenticate and then to go to your set of applications and your data. And that concept just frankly doesn't make any more sense.
But it hasn't made sense for a long time either, right? Raj, I remember speaking to Jay Chowdhury, who's the CEO of Zscaler. And Jay told me this 5, 6, 7 years ago, that the idea of being remote, VPNing into your office land to then go back out to the cloud and then come back in to go back out was ludicrous, right? And the only reason is you said, oh, well, we had to run them through the domain. We had to We had to, verify their identity in there. It didn't make sense then, and I think we've been searching for something since then. And what's gone on with COVID, I think is just, sometimes you need that. Necessity is the mother of invention, right? You need that event to make it burning clear to people. Just think about how much bandwidth is wasted doing that, right? Instead of going direct, you go through here, out that way. The shortest distance is the straight line. And
I think that's the core part of the domainless concept. Is it's a point-to-point connection. It's right from that user, wherever they are, physically with their machine, going to whatever IT resources they may need, whether those are controlled by the organization or whether they're not controlled by the organization. But you're right, it's a point-to-point thought process, which
world.
Right, but which then actually creates a huge opportunity to create additional layers of security. And so you talked about the attack surface expanding so greatly with the sort of advent of cloud infrastructure, web apps, remote, non-Windows OSs. All those things have increased the attack surface. But now, when you're in a point-to-point model, you can actually shrink the attack surface. You can make sure that that whole transaction, end to end, from the user going to their IT resources and getting their information, is secure. So we know that we can make sure that that person really is who they say they are. We can add multi-factor authentication. You can do all kinds of biometrics. So that's a great example. The next step is your device. You want to make sure that that device is secure. There's lots of ways to make sure that that happens. You want to make sure that that connection to that network, connection from the network to that IT resource is secure as well. So there's lots of mechanisms to do that. And then ultimately, the end IT resource has to have the right authorization. So you want to make sure that that person really does have rights to access whatever that data is, the application, the server, whatever it may be. So that whole end-to-end transaction can be secured at a much higher level. When you think about the concept of a domain, once you logged in and you were inside the confines of the domain, effectively the security was gone. It was, you had rights to everything. You can go see everything on the network. You could go access what you needed to. And the idea was to make it super frictionless, to make it easy. Once you were in the confines of the walls of the physical space, if you will, we thought you were secure. So that's sort of the difference between the legacy approach and the new approach.
Absolutely. It worked, and not here knocking it. It worked well for the world it was designed for. We're in
100%. It was absolutely game changing, and probably for 10 years after we introduced the domain controller back in late '99 was when sort of the most popular domain controller appeared. That was the only way things are done. And even today, most folks think of the domain controller as a necessity because it has been for so long. And so this new concept of saying, no, you don't need to have a domain. You can actually have a domainless approach to controlling access to IT resources, to securing your infrastructure. It's a novel concept.
Yeah, well, it is novel right now, but I think it becomes the new normal, just as we're talking about all of these new normals coming. So, so we're going to define the domainless enterprise here, right? And what are the things it really hits on? Raj, I think you mentioned some of these, but let's crystallize it for our audience. And again, I remind our audience, any questions, please use the question section of the control panel, and we'll try to help you out here. But what we're talking about is user access control and core identity, right? And that's a concept too, that your identity kind of follows you or defines you, whether you are on a SaaS app, that's on Amazon, let's say, or Google's GCP, or on an internal app out of a data center or somewhere else, right? It's your core identity and your control, your whole access control is built into your identity. But it also talks about device management beyond just the person, right? And levels of trust there. And then in today's world, you can't have any of that without monitoring, right? You got to make sure that everything's working right. And even though we've set it up, you got to have audit trails. You got to have someone kind of watching this. Preferably, you want some sort of ML or AI kind of monitoring that allows, or an automated monitoring that will raise alarms or something like that. Talk to us about how the JumpCloud idea or concept of domainless enterprise deals with those three concepts?
Yeah, it's a great question, Alan. So I go back to the comment of, controlling the whole end-to-end transaction. So when you think about the point-to-point concept of giving people access to the things that they need to have access to in a domainless world, you're trying to make sure that those are highly secure transactions. So having a core directory, making sure that everybody knows what they have access rights to and somebody is controlling that. You want to make sure that the posture of the machine, the machine is your gateway to everything that you're going to access. So if the machine has been compromised, why wouldn't the rest of the transaction be compromised? And Alan, you and I know that because we worked on that, a while ago with network access control. And those concepts of network access control are reappearing in this concept of the domainless enterprise. People want to make sure that these systems, these Mac, Windows, and Linux systems are secure because they're the gateway to everything that people are going to access. I think we went through a period of time where we thought, tablets or phones would be the answer or network computers would be the answer. But even research that people have done lately is that the systems, these Mac, Windows, and Linux systems people have are even more vital, more important now in COVID times. So people aren't probably going to give up these high-powered machines, which are getting better and better either. And then the last piece, which you said is monitoring, is exactly right. You want to make sure that only the right people have access to the right pieces of applications, server infrastructure, whatever it may be. The number one, we know this, the number one way that people are compromised today is identity theft. So somebody's identity is compromised. It doesn't matter all the great technology that you put in place to catch an attacker. They have valid credentials. They have valid admin credentials, and they go right through all the security systems straight to your core digital assets. Well, if that ever happens, you want to make sure that you understand that whole transaction. Hopefully it never happens. Hopefully you've used multi-factor authentication and other techniques to eliminate that chance. But that's really what the domainless enterprise is trying to make sure that we do, is make sure that all these transactions are secure, make sure that people have access to everything they need to have access to in a frictionless, easy manner without all the overhead for IT admins of running a domain where there's nothing left on the on-prem infrastructure.
Excellent. Hey, Jade, I'm going to ask you to go to the next slide, but while we do, Raj, someone from our audience, and I think the next slide sort of secure remote and work and resources. Someone wants to know, how do we manage this core identity in the case of hybrid cloud? And it's not just hybrid cloud, I think it's multi-cloud as well. And that really, to me anyway, is at the very core, no pun intended, at the very core of what JumpCloud does, right? In that when you go hybrid, when you go multi, you need kind of one directory or that rules them all, but that's not even the right concept. You need a domainless directory that transcends.
Absolutely.
Like this. Talk
Absolutely.
to us. How do we manage that with JumpCloud?
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, the question's the right question. The center of the domainless enterprise, the center of every network now is identities. So it used to be the systems and the infrastructure itself, maybe the Wi-Fi or things like that. But we all know today the most important thing is someone's identity. It's the way that people access everything they need to. It's the way work gets done, but it's also the highest risk portion of a network where people can be compromised if their identities are overtaken. So a core directory service now is basically, it's more modern, it's hybrid cloud, it's multi-cloud, it's on-prem, it's remote, it's multi-platform, it's multi-protocol. It doesn't matter where it is or where the person is, what the resource is, where it is, all those things are flexible. That's not the history of directory services. No. The history of directory services is that, a long time ago, we had this thing called LDAP and Open LDAP, which is still, one of the most important authentication protocols around. But that was, everything needed to be done through the LDAP protocol. Well, that didn't work completely. So we then created this next generation of directory service, which was basically all focused on Windows machines and Windows applications. And so then that worked for a while, but now then we had SaaS applications, cloud infrastructure, we had Mac and Linux devices, we've got mobile users. you've got all these changes, and Wi-Fi for that matter, all these things that changed, and all those required new tools to sit on top of it because that core directory service wasn't able to be flexible enough for everything. So a modern directory has to be multi-protocol, it has to be multi-vendor, it has to be multi-platform, it has to be location agnostic. It has to be basically that identity that services whatever IT resource a person needs to access.
Absolutely.
And
Raj,
it needs to do it securely too, Alan, right? It needs
well,
to.
we're going to jump
Yeah.
on security, I think, in the next slide. But our audience, and you know what? Thank you so much, folks, for the questions. They're coming in fast and furious.
That's awesome.
And we have a decent amount of people on. I appreciate it. But this next question, Raj, is kind of, Jada, I think if we can go back to the previous slide, we're not quite ready for security here. This is on that secure remote work access comes. Here's a great question, follow up to that, Raj. Is there a way to go domainless with enterprise apps like Office 365, or now it's called Microsoft 365, including endpoint devices like smartphones? Some of what you were talking about here applies, but a good example, let's say I'm connected to MS Teams and I want to collaborate with a dev team with teams using SharePoint, GitHub, Bitbucket, without the overhead of logging into a domain controller, but have complete comfort of being secure. To me, that sounds like a JumpCloud use case. But
absolutely, yeah, for sure. And this is, let's step out of JumpCloud for a second, but the concept of the domainless is absolutely encompassing of that scenario where you are logging in to Microsoft 365 and you're enabling access through Teams or whatever the particular Microsoft application is. And that could be done ensuring the person is who they say they are through multi-factor authentication or biometrics. It ensures that the device, maybe it's a smartphone. Is it a company-owned smartphone? Is it a clean smartphone? Does it have an MDM on it? All those things are possible. Is it on a network that is trusted? Is it on an office network, a home network? What is it? Is it coming from a country that is the right country? And then, of course, the authorization of, do you have access to Teams as a user in this? Do you have access to that group in Teams that you want to communicate to? If you do, then all that happens. But absolutely, that's a great example of how the domainless enterprise can work beautifully and how JumpCloud can support that, in fact.
Just one more quick question on this, then we'll pop to the next slide if it's okay, Raj. What steps, concepts does JumpCloud consider in order to balance simplified and secure with the privacy of individual user access, i.e. personal devices in a domainless enterprise?
Yeah, it's a great question. So ultimately, you can still obviously do the domainless enterprise without having corporate machines, having personal machines, BYOD, if you will. You do lose something. So I would say that if a person does not want to have that device be secured, if you will, or monitored, then that portion of the domainless enterprise is going to be missed. You'll still authenticate with the user, make sure they say who they really are. The network still can be secured, where they're coming from, and is it a safe, secure network? And then the authorization on the end application or server or data can be there, but you miss that major step where a system is absolutely a gateway to all those things. And I would argue that it's all possible, but I think as an organization, you would be missing a major part of the security.
Yeah. But these are the trade-offs we make, right? And it's been, you and I have been in security a long time.
And I would say domainless does not mean you are impacting someone's privacy. So I would say domainless does mean it's a point-to-point connection, and generally that organization and JumpCloud, because we're sort of the core center of that world, the directory, we're not privy to what's going on in that transaction. So we don't know we just are authorizing the transaction, not what's in it. And so I think someone could still take comfort that they have the privacy of having that transaction secured, but not having their contents be viewed by us or anybody else for that matter.
Makes perfect sense. Raj, before I'm sorry, the questions kind of took us down.
Are they going in pretty quickly?
No, I think we did a bunch of them. We're ready for more if you want, folks. Put them in there. but we went down a track there. On this slide here around cloud directory service, because that really gets to the core of what a domainless enterprise is about, right? Have we hit everything you wanted to hit here before we move on to the next slide?
I think one of the other things that I would say around the domainless enterprise, and we'll just go up to a little bit of a higher level, we're advocating it's an open architecture. So you want to have, whether it's JumpCloud or somebody else, whether it's different technologies or tools that you use as part of it, it should be a broader concept than just JumpCloud. I mean, you should have choice. It should be cross-platform. It should be vendor agnostic. It should work with whatever is out there that you need to access. Ultimately, organizations want to choose technology that works for them, and they want their infrastructure tools to enable that. They don't want to be funneled into only using a particular vendor's technology. I think it should be standards-based. So obviously, that just makes it much easier to support all the things that an organization, an IT organization, wants to support. It's got to be location agnostic at this point. So location independent. We're all working from home around the world, so that's a key requirement. I'd say zero trust is at the foundation of a lot of this as well. I think it's beyond zero trust, but those concepts should be a part of what a domainless enterprise is. And then ultimately, we also think that the management overhead of this should not be high. Ideally, it's a single pane of glass. Ideally, all these things come together so that an IT organization can easily instrument and manage and control their infrastructure. So those are some core concepts of what domainless enterprise means. And for us, a cloud directory service is at the center of virtually all of that.
Excellent. I hate to do this to you, but before we go to the next slide,
we got another question.
Yeah, we got a few more questions. Well, I'm saving some for later, so we have a little something for later, but another question here. So what if you have an on-prem environment, and if you have a typical domain controller on site, the connections for services would go quickly and the process would complete. However, if you're using a cloud-hosted situation, would this not slow down the on-site communication? I'm looking at it from a hybrid base setup. JumpCloud would make sense, obviously, in that cloud infrastructure, but how would it affect the job scheduled on the on-prem side? So do you go hybrid JumpCloud here and normal here, or does JumpCloud go both? What's best practice?
It's a great question. I mean, obviously there's lots of trade-offs, and it's not a all or nothing. There's a continuum here too. I mean, we do realize that most organizations in the world today have a domain. So to get to the domainless world, it's not going to be a light switch. It's not going to be on or off. There's going to be a continuum. So a lot of folks do have on-prem infrastructure, but we also know that the on-prem infrastructure is moving to the cloud. So there may be a period of time where you're still maintaining your on-prem infrastructure. You're starting to use something like JumpCloud to extend and create that domainless environment. And then over time, as more of your workloads and more of your applications shift to the cloud, you're turning down what you had internally. So that's how it's going to work over time. It's not going to be an all or nothing immediately. Now,
but do you lose anything, Raj?
Absolutely. Let's go back to the question. Could you lose a little bit on speed? Absolutely, you would lose something potentially on speed. And I don't know if it would be noticeable. That would be, per network, per infrastructure, on whether that was noticeable or not. Generally, authentication in that transaction is a very lightweight transaction. It's also periodic. It's not constant. So the overhead on that shouldn't be very significant. The other risk, obviously, that everybody should be aware of is just like the problems I had with the internet at the beginning of this webinar. You are at the mercy of the internet infrastructure, and so there is risk to that. But you're also at the mercy of your own infrastructure as well. You could have a switch break. You could have an internet line get cut on your particular infrastructure. So I think you're trading one for the other. I would say we know where the world's headed. It's headed to a much more cloud-focused, cloud-forward infrastructure. So, our sense is for those folks, that's going to ultimately be where you're going to end up, is sort of in this domainless enterprise environment. So you're probably better off starting to take steps to get there. Does that make sense, Alan?
Absolutely. And the person who asked the question also said that was a tremendously transparent response. He really appreciates it. So, all right, with that said, I'm putting away a couple more questions for later, but let's move to our next slide if it's okay. So perimeter security versus the dynamic security model. You know, and Raj, let's be honest, right? You and I grew up in the perimeter security world.
We're that old, Alan.
Yeah. We started a company that was intrusion detection at that perimeter. And remember, we had to make changes to the ring in the Linux kernel so we could go greater than a gigabit, or maybe it was 100 megabits. I don't remember.
Yeah.
And it's what a disaster that was, my God. But, you know, but that was that world we grew in. We grew up in that moat and castle perimeter. And now we're in what we call a dynamic security model. Tell us the difference and how it relates to domain and domainless.
Absolutely. So, I mean, the world's been changing over the last 10, 15 years. And it started very strong in the domain model, as you articulated, Alan. We were all on-prem, we were in the physical confines, we all had Windows machines, we had a domain controller. We got there, we logged in, and boom, we had access to everything. And the IT admins could control, they could make sure our printers were set up, they could make sure that we had access to the file shares, they could make sure we had access to applications and data. So it all made sense. And then when we were traveling, when we would go out traveling on sales calls like we did, Alan, we would VPN back to the network, and then we would have access to our data, our file shares or applications that we needed to access. That's the way the world was. And it's still, for many organizations, it is still that way today, as crazy as that sounds, but it's also started to change. So, and it was a little bit of death of a thousand cuts. So maybe in 2010, you added G Suite or Google Apps at the time, as it was known. Maybe you added a little bit of AWS. Maybe it wasn't across all of your applications. Maybe it was just for a small chunk of them. Maybe you added file sharing through Box or Dropbox or things like that. Maybe you let in a few Macs. Maybe you let in some iPhones and Android devices. So all of a sudden, this concept of the domain started having a lot of holes to it. And I think now in COVID times, it is highly apparent at how little the old traditional domain controller actually manages anymore. A lot of people use Macs. We have our infrastructure at AWS. We use G Suite or Microsoft 365. Many, if not most, of our applications are in the cloud. So at some point, you have to say, which way are we going here? And do I really need this on-prem infrastructure that I've built? And as I try and move more workloads and more infrastructure to the cloud, why do I still have that on-prem domain? Maybe a different model is going to work in the future.
So Raj, I would probably take I think you're being kind. I take it one step further. It's not a question of maybe I let this in or maybe I let that in. It's more a question of, this is what we're going to do because our business demands it. And either you figure out how to make it work or we do it without you. And that's always been an issue in security, right? We could jump up and down and say no all we want, but when that train leaves the station, the train has left the station. And so to me, and this has been a thing, it's got to be, yes, we can. Yes, we can. And we can maybe by going from domain to domainless in this instance, right? But we cannot, meaning the security world, and even to a certain extent the IT world, we've got to serve our customer, which is the rest of the organization. We have got to enable people, not put up barriers to
Alan, I'd like to think about it as, what's the future of work going to look like, right? I mean, you're right. IT organizations are there to enable their organization. It is to help them generate more revenue, control costs, be secure. They're enabling their organization. And obviously with all the DevOps work that's going on, it's an incredibly important part of a business these days. But when you think about how people want to work in the future, they're going to be mobile. They're going to want to use the tools and technology that are most productive to them. They're not going to want to use sort of the corporate standards, if you will, right? They're going to use whatever's best for them. And by the way, these days, every line of business, every group within an organization has incredible technology. I mean, there are tools and technology that are specific to probably every type of worker in an organization. So why would you go purchase sort of generic tools that only work at the top level, but not the specific tools that are really tuned to a particular group or a particular job function? You're not. You're going to enable all these different types of tools and technology. So whatever the IT infrastructure is, it's going to have to support that future of work concept, which is going to be anywhere in the world. It's going to be using any type of device, and it's going to be using virtually any type of IT resource out there.
But here's the kicker. Enabling all that while also enabling better security.
That's
right?
the trick. That's super hard to do.
That's the 1 + 1 = 3. And that actually, so that's our next question. How prepared are we to avoid security breaches following this domainless enterprise model?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you got to go back and you got to say, how are security breaches really happening, right? So the number one way we know this is through identity compromises. So that's at the center of the domainless enterprise. It's making sure that that identity is as secure as possible. You're going to want to use multi-factor authentication, biometrics. You're going to use all these types of activities to make sure that it is really the person that needs to access. You're going to use ML or AI technology to make sure that they're coming from the right locations, they're doing the right things, you know, all the things that you can do to detect that person is the right person. Absolutely, that's going to be the number one issue that people face in security with moving forward and with the domainless enterprise. But that's also what the domainless enterprise really sort of centers on. That's why it was created. The second step is obviously the system itself, making sure that the system is secure. So again, that's part of the domainless enterprise. It's what you and I worked on 10, 15 years ago around network access control. It's making sure that the posture of that device is clean, it's secure, it's trustworthy. So that's a core part of it. And then you're going to go to the next step, which is making sure that that network is secure. You're going to want to make sure that there's a SSL connection or a TLS connection or whatever the right level of, you know, end-to-end encryption is between those two points. And then the fourth step is going to be making sure that that target IT resource has the right permissions, the right authorization mechanisms to make sure that that person really has access. So I absolutely think security is at the core of the domainless enterprise, and it acknowledges probably the most important fact, which is identity compromises are the number one mechanism for how we all get compromised today.
Absolutely. I want to stress one thing to the person asking the question, though, is this. Do I think a domainless enterprise system increases our level or our ability to secure ourselves from data breaches? Absolutely, positively. And Raj, I think you've made a great case for it. One thing I've learned, and I know you've learned, no one is out here promising bulletproof security and that we're going to put an end to data breaches, because quite frankly, the security industry is full of snake oil people who've been promising that for 20 years. Nothing you're going to do is going to totally, you know, void you or insulate you from ever having a security breach, because there's so many factors here, including the human element. And so no one can guarantee you, but will this domainless enterprise give you a potential higher level, a better way of securing against breaches? Yes, I think so, especially when taken into account that it recognizes the realities of today's access world, right? The realities of today's identity, devices, location, and where we're accessing things, just as the slides previous to this laid out. So if you didn't do that, you'd really be in trouble. Right, because you don't want to fight the next war with the last war's technology or architecture.
I think that's what this is a nod to, is making sure that everybody realizes that identities are the number one approach to getting compromised. And you and I talked about this actually, Alan, last week, where you change your password, where it gets changed is a core factor in how people get phished. So, you know, do they get compromised because they see an email and they think it's from Google or from Microsoft and they go and change their password, right? So part of what we've done is to change that model and mechanism. We want you to change your password on your machine, and then it's going to propagate to wherever you need it to go to. But you don't want to get phished. And a core cloud directory service that does things the right way is going to help prevent that. Is it going to be 100% bulletproof? Absolutely not. There's nothing in technology that we have today that is 100% bulletproof. We all know this. Google's been compromised before, Microsoft's been compromised before, Amazon's been compromised before, everybody's been compromised. So the chances that anything that we buy in technology is 100% bulletproof, I think it's not right. It's not true.
And anyone who tells you that, run. But anyway, let's move on to our next slide, which I think might be one of our last slides, and then we have a few more questions. And I know you're welcome for that answer. Someone said good answer, thanks. You're welcome. We try. Raj, so let's move on here. Going domainless, transitioning to the dynamic security model. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is what we talked about just a few minutes ago, where most people do have an on-prem domain and now they want to transition. So how do you do that? Well, it's not going to be a light switch. It's going to be taking it in steps, baby steps. And so maybe the first thing you do is you get control over your web applications. Maybe it's you get control of your cloud infrastructure. Maybe it's you get control over your Mac and Linux systems that are already within your perimeter. And then ultimately you just keep adding on. As you move more workloads, as you go more to the cloud, you're going to ultimately eliminate those on-prem infrastructure components. So the domain controller may be around for a little while as you make this transition, but over time it's going to go away. I mean, this is no different than what people saw with when they first maybe started to move to, for instance, Google Apps or Office 365. Maybe they kept some of their applications around, and then over time you start to shift. So that's what I think is going to happen for the vast majority of organizations. But then there's a whole category of organizations that maybe they were born in the last 5 to 10 years and they never had a domain controller because they used a cafe style internet model where basically their on-prem network was really just Wi-Fi, and you would come in and you would connect and you would go from there. And for those folks, it's taking it to the next level. You're already starting with sort of this base, which is you don't have a domain controller. Now you're going to add a cloud directory to make sure that you have full control over access, and then you're going to add the other components to make sure that you have a full domainless model.
Excellent, good stuff. You know, and that's another point that I think our audience should take note of, Raj, is, look, it's real easy to do this on a greenfield, right? If someone comes to me and says, start from scratch, clean blank piece of paper, of course I'm going to use the latest, greatest stuff, and I don't have to worry about my legacies and stuff like that. Unfortunately, most of us don't have that, advantage. Most of us don't have that luxury. We find our domains where we find them, and we take them as we take them, right? And it's our job, meaning our audience out there, to transition and to move them forward, and that's part of what JumpCloud's mission is, to help these people move forward. You wish everyone came to you with a green field like that, where you could say, okay, let's just start from scratch and keep it clean. But it's not the way the world works. And so any move to a domainless enterprise, any move towards this cloud transformation model that so many of us are involved in now, has to have that transition, that migration path. You can't throw out. I remember watching a CIO of a company that recently declared bankruptcy, one of the large rental car companies. When they decided to move, when they decided to move to the cloud, their board came down with the thing that, look, just stand up a cloud service, and when that cloud service is done, shut down the on-prem. There was no migration. It was just, we're going to invest $700 million in moving to the cloud over the next X years. And just as we stand up a cloud service, we shut down the on-prem. There was never a migration path. And it was kind of radical. I mean,
I mean, look, that may work in some cases where, that clean break. I would argue that that's high risk for sure. I think
Well,
it's a
they
lot
did
of,
go bankrupt as a result. I don't know if it's a result of that,
yeah, I'm
but
not sure it was a result of
yeah,
that, but it was maybe a factor. But
yeah,
look, I think that model is sort of in the software world, version 1 to version 2. And you and I
right.
have been through this. We're going to rewrite version 2, and
No
we're going to
backwards
throw,
compatibility though.
right, exactly. And look, does that work? I'd say maybe in some cases it works. Probably in most cases it does not. Um, the better path is, I would say, a baby step transition. And that's one of the things that we've built into our platform with JumpCloud is we have an AD migration utility, which does exactly that. It takes you baby steps to migrate from your on-prem domain controller into JumpCloud. It does it in a very specific way so that everything's maintained and everything's going to work after you do it. But it gives you control to do it step by step. And that's got to be there. I think that we're going to totally let go to get a grip again is probably not the right
Yeah,
way.
that's a good way of talking about it. Yep. All right, Raj. Before we wrap up this slide, is there anything else we want to talk about in terms of migrating to a cloud directory service?
I think we covered a lot of the key pieces here.
All right. Jade, if you could go to slide 8. So Raj, I've got 3 or 4 questions here that I saved for the end from our audience that really were kind of JumpCloud product specific for
Sure.
those of you out here who might have questions around JumpCloud. And I'm going to warn you up front, some of them aren't easy. Otherwise, I would have answered them. But,
Okay.
all right. So
Hopefully I can answer them.
and if not, you know what? We have them here, and we will get them emailed
Yep,
from
absolutely.
They're really kind of product specific stuff. Before I do that, though, let me quickly, because I'll forget. Our 4 Amazon winners of Amazon gift cards today were Daniel E, Ian H, that's I-A-N, maybe it's pronounced I-N-H, Vanessa W, and Joellen G. So our folks will reach out to you. Congratulations, enjoy the Amazon gift card and buy something nice. Anyway, Raj, our first question.
Yep.
So this person would love to know how JumpCloud has evolved over the past 3 years or so. He used to work with a company that was using JumpCloud, and the integrations were not always easy, a little bit one-offy. They used Bidium for SSO, for instance, and it took us a bit to get the two connected. Has JumpCloud started doing more in regard to integrations or SSO?
Yeah, absolutely. So 3 years ago, our single sign-on functionality was nascent. So it's not surprising that it was a little bit more difficult. I would say that if you went to take a look at our single sign-on capabilities today, they're incredibly robust. So we use SAML. We also use SCIM. So we have SAML just-in-time provisioning as well. The process of integrating applications to it is far easier than it was 3 years ago. Obviously, the product's evolved tremendously over the last 3 years, but I would encourage you to go take a look. It's pretty slick and it's pretty easy now. And we're continuing to add a lot of functionality into the single sign-on area, if you will.
Good stuff, thank you. I hope that answered his question for him.
Yeah, I would say, and by the way, I would say you can use our free account. So it's a free account, 10 users, 10 systems, free forever. So go try it. That's the best way to see whether it works for you. And obviously our team is there to help. So if you need to have any questions answered, we have an in-app chat 24/7 for the first 10 days. So you can easily get the help that you need to get up and running.
Great. Our next question is, how does JumpCloud work with Zscaler? I don't know if you know that, Raj.
I don't know. So I don't know enough about Zscaler first and foremost. My guess is we probably have a single sign-on integration, SAML connector. I believe Zscaler probably supports SAML. So my guess is that that's probably one of the core things that we have. But I would guess that the question is a far deeper question around, Zscaler, is my understanding, a very high level, is they basically are a proxy for where your traffic goes.
Right,
so
they're setting up a sandbox in the cloud that's looking at that traffic coming in, making sure it's not malicious, before it hits your device or what have you.
Yeah, let me do a
Again,
little
I'm not a-
research. Yeah, I'm not an expert on Zscaler by any stretch.
No,
You know, I
but
would say that part of the domainless enterprise is to avoid any access gateways. So that's one of the big differences between, or one change I'd say between zero trust and what we believe is the future. We don't believe that you're going to have VPN bottlenecks or access gateway bottlenecks. So that's going to be a difference, what we think long term that happens.
excellent. Next question, Roger. If we only have a few minutes here.
Yeah, sure.
How does JumpCloud compare to Okta and OneLogon with respect to this domainless solution?
Yeah, I mean, I think of Okta and OneLogin as basically Active Directory extension technology. So when they started their businesses, basically Active Directory was the foundation of virtually every network, and they saw an opportunity to go execute against web applications, to take an identity that was in Active Directory and extend it to web applications. So I think, in my view, those are sort of building on top of Active Directory, which is a domain controller, and that's sort of their perspective. JumpCloud's pretty different. I mean, we're basically saying, hey, you don't need a domain controller anymore. You don't need Active Directory anymore. So that's a pretty fundamental difference. We do have a lot of customers that integrate us and Okta, us and OneLogin as well, but we also have single sign-on functionality baked into our platform. So most of our customers will use us as the cloud directory, as well as the single sign-on web application, single sign-on solution.
Excellent. I have one more. It's not really a question, it's a comment, Raj, but I saved it for last because I thought it was a good one. And it's, if anyone has an application that they don't see within the list in JumpCloud, they can open a ticket with JumpCloud support and request it to be adding on, and the support team will help getting it done. I think that's a great comment to end this thing, Raj, is, you know what? No one can foresee every application that everyone's going to use and everything. Yeah. But if you have a partner that you work with in terms of your domainless enterprise partner, anything is possible. And I think that is a good way to send this one off. Raj, I think it's the first time we ever finished early. I'm like really proud of ourselves. We got
finished on time. Yep.
Yeah, on time.
Let everybody go do that.
On time. We ended on time. It's a first. Hey man, fantastic work with JumpCloud. You know what we didn't say? For people who want to get more information, where are they going?
They're going to jumpcloud.com. Absolutely do that. We also have a Slack community called JumpCloud Lounge. So please join that as well. And
how do they join it? Do you know?
It's on Slack. So I don't know beyond that. So
you probably got to get an invite to the Slack. If you go to jumpcloud.com, look for the JumpCloud Slack community.
It's a public channel.
Automated invite.
Yeah, it should be a public channel, so everybody should be able to join.
Yep.
We also host an office hours every Friday, which is a great sort of admin to admin community where we get people together to talk about what's going on in the IT world. So that's been we started that as soon as COVID hit, and that's been an exciting place for admins to get together and talk about not necessarily about JumpCloud. It's really about what's going on with them, and different things that they can do to help get through this COVID times, the next stage of technology that they might need, questions, and build that community around IT admins.
Okay, and through the magic of the internet, Raj, I just put in the chat window to everyone a link to the JC Slack Lounge.
Cool, thanks, Alan.
If anyone's interested in that, they can go hit it on there. Some of the folks are asking, where can they get JumpCloud swag? Go on the Slack Lounge and ask them.
Absolutely.
One of the things about this COVID stuff, it's hard.
Drop us a note. We're happy to send you some swag.
It costs more to send than it does to make. I know we do it here at MediaOps. But anyway, Hey Raj, we're out of time. Thank you so much for taking time. Internet problems.
This was great. Yep.
All right.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining another DevOps.com webinar here. We hope you enjoyed it. We'll have more with our friends from JumpCloud in the weeks ahead, so stay tuned for that. Stay tuned for the rest of our webinars as well. Keep reading DevOps.com, Security Boulevard, Container Journal. Check out JumpCloud. This is Alan Shimel. We'll see you on our next webinar. Bye-bye. All right,
Mark it 9.
right on time.
Yep.